Good evening. I'd like to welcome you to our Sunday School Hour. I know that I'm not Mr. Knotts. I'm filling in for him at this time, but I wanted to give you a lesson that has been really important to me, something that the Lord has shown me and someone in the past had given me these truths, and I wanted to share them with you. Now, today we're going to look at Acts chapter 27, verses 14 through 29, one of my favorite stories in all the Bible. Here we have Paul. And he's actually aboard a prison ship, and he had come from Caesarea with King Agrippa, and he was now on a prison ship that consisted of 276 men. He was under the care of several centurions, namely one by the name of Julius, and they're on their way down to Rome, or over to Rome and up. And so they're coming around the island of Cyprus, and things are going pretty good. They come to the island of Crete, and the wind starts to pick up a little bit. There's a storm in the air, so to speak. And as they come around Crete and they start heading toward Malta, there's a wind that picks up. And so much so in Acts chapter 27, they give the storm a name called Euroclydon. And men are fearful of this storm, and it's known to be one of the worst types of storms on the sea, similar to what we would think as maybe a Category 5 tornado on Earth, or on the land. So there's really a fearfulness going on. And during this time that we see this taking place, there's some great things that the Lord shows us in this passage. Now, I'm a big fan of anything nautical, whether it is fishing for crab in Alaska, whether it's tuna fishing, anything that deals with a boat, I'm excited about. I'm a guy that really enjoys it. And of course, one of my dreams one day is to own a boat. So in heading toward that dream, my family and I, we went out and we got some boats. You say, what did you get? We got some inflatable kayaks, and we've really enjoyed those kayaks for now, but that's probably the stage we're heading into before we maybe invest in a boat someday, but that's our goal, is to have a boat. So I love boats, and to read this story about what Paul was going through and to see this lesson come out in real life is just amazing to me, and that's probably why I really enjoy it every time I read it. But here again, these men are, and Paul, 276 total, are heading toward the Malta area as they head toward ultimately Rome. And as they head toward Malta, the storm and the winds start to pick up, and the men feel that the storm is starting to pull them into the island of Malta. They're going to run aground, and they're really scared. And so they start to throw things off the boat to lighten it up so they don't shipwreck. And then we see that they start to get closer, and the men are scared, so they take a measurement, a rope or a cable with a weight on the end, and they start to put that down to see what their level is, and they notice that the level of the water decreases, so they know they're getting closer and closer to land. And so they're really scared at this time. They're not sure what they're going to do. And Paul makes a promise, and he tells the men, he said that not to fear, because there's not going to be one person that dies in this episode. So they were a little fearful, but Paul gives a promise to them. And what happens is, so they start to get closer to the shore, and they crank up the bow, so to speak. They crank up the boat as far as with cables. They reinforce it, and they strengthen the sails, and they're really being as cautious as they can. And one thing that they do in order to slow down the boat, we see this in verse number 29. It says, "Then fearing lest we should fall upon the rocks, they cast 4 anchors out of the stern and wished for the day." So they said, here we go, we're going to cast 4 anchors out to slow us down, and we're just hoping and we're wishing that this does the trick, because if those 4 anchors lock in, then they're going to slow down enough that the boat will not crash against the land or the rocks. And but ultimately what does happen as we read through the story, we see that the boat does crash, although it's not tragic, but it is crashed and breaks apart, and the men are struggling on what to do. The centurions get together and they decide on the possibility of maybe killing the soldiers, because if the soldiers, killing the prisoners, because if the prisoners escape, then they will ultimately face their own demise of execution for allowing that to happen. But Julius had such a great relationship with Paul, and just by what you read in here, there's a possibility that Paul had shared the gospel and been a real testimony to the men on that boat. So much so that Julius, in order that Paul would not be one of the ones killed, he convinced the other soldiers, Roman soldiers, not to slay the prisoners so that Paul could be saved as well. And so the men are allowed to swim, and the soldiers are allowed to swim the remainder of the way to the island where they are all safe, as Paul had promised. But I want you to see some things. There were 4 anchors I told you about that in verse 29 that they put out. But also, as we look at this passage, we can notice that there are 4 anchors that we can apply to our lives that God gave us as we face stormy seas. And of course, you know, as what we're facing today, as you look out across our nation and you see the turmoil, the storms, the things that we're facing on a spiritual side, the struggles, the battles, there are some things we need to be reminded of. In this passage, Paul shares some things in this passage that I want you to see that really lend credence to some truths that will help us, not only in a national sense, but personally, because each and every one of us are going through trials. We're going through some stormy things in our life. I can't speak for you, and you can't speak for me, but you know between you and God what you're going through. And I want you to see a few things here. First anchor that God gives us is found in verse 23 of Acts chapter 27 that we're in. Look with me. It says, "For there stood by me this night the angel of God, whose I am and whom I serve." So when Paul was telling them in previous verses to be of good cheer, no one's going to die, he made a statement here. He says, "For there stood by me this night the angel of God." And the first anchor that Paul gives us is the anchor of God's presence, the anchor of God's presence. You know, regardless of the storms in your life, God tells us He's going to be in our presence. We're going to be in His presence. He's always in us, or near us. The psalmist in Psalm 139 was very clear on that. There's nowhere you can go on the planet, nowhere you can go in the universe, nowhere you can go in existence that God is not there. He says even if He lays down His head in hell and he goes to the pit of hell, God is always present. He's always around. And so we can go to the deepest parts of the ocean, the highest parts of the sky, the furthest reaches of the universe, but God is always present. And He says in Matthew 28 verse 20 that He'll never leave us nor forsake us. He's always there. And right here Paul was making it very clear in verse 23 that God was present in this storm, this terrible tragedy that was taking place. Dr. Tony Campolo, he made a statement. He was a spiritual advisor to presidents in the past, and he made a statement, told a story about when he was in 2nd grade and he had moved to the city. His mom had hired a young lady to walk Tony to school, a 2nd grader, and walk him back to school each and every day. She would pay this person, the mother would pay this person a nickel each day for walking Tony up and back from school. And one day Tony, in his rebellious state as a 2nd grader, began to dispute with his mom and say, "Mom, I can do it myself. You give me a nickel for the week and I'll walk myself to school and back." And so after much struggle and argument, Tony's mom gave in and said, "Okay, Tony, let's see if you can do this." And so Tony would walk 8 blocks to school and walk 8 blocks back on his own each and every day. And he did that and was able to finish out his schooling, his career that way. And years later, after he had finished school and they were having a family get-together and meeting and just having a good time, his mom was present, Tony made the statement that in a braggadocious sense, showing his independence, that he was one that was able to walk himself to school as a 2nd grader and walk back each and every day. And he did that as an elementary student, as a young student. And his mother piped up and said, "Tony, that's not the case." And he looked at her and he said, "You didn't know this, but every time you walked to school, I walked behind you. Every day you walked from school, I was right there walking behind you. And I would keep myself well hidden, and you couldn't see me, but I was there." And she told Tony that I would stand there and I would stay back just in case you needed me. And so she was present at that whole experience, and Tony had thought he was doing it independently. And you see, God is present, but sometimes we don't acknowledge him. We don't realize that he's there. We treat him as if he's some cosmic entity that is away off in a rocking chair somewhere and doesn't care about us. But the truth is, he's right there. He's in our presence, and we can be guaranteed of that. The second anchor I want to show you is found in verse 25. It says, "Wherefore, sirs, be of good cheer, for I believe God," and look at this, "that it shall be as it was me." The anchor of God promises. And back in Acts 3, verse 11, God, he will make it to Rome. That was a promise to God. Paul come to Paul hinged him was like Rome, like he said I was going to bear witness. And promise back in. So that's sure that it will be even as told to me. Kinds of throughout Scripture, the chapter 18 makes it clear that it's possible for God to lie. In verse 19 as well, it says the anchor of the soul, sure and talks about his unchangeability. The fact that when he makes a promise, when he makes a guarantee, it's going to happen. You can mark it down. The anchor of God's promise. It's going to happen if he promises it. Interesting enough, Dr. Everett R. Storms, he was a pastor years ago in Ontario, and he wrote an article and published it in Contact magazine. And in that article, he stated that the Holy Scriptures contain a grand total of 8,810 promises. And he says, and the question is, how do you know that, Dr. Storms? And he says, because I've counted them. And I quote, he says, "All my life I have seen various figures quoted as to the number of promises in the Bible. The one most generally given is 30,000. Since this is a round number with 4 zeros in it, I have always been a little suspicious about it. Furthermore, since there are only 31,101 verses in the Bible, it would mean that there would be practically one promise in every verse. I do not guarantee my count is perfect, but it is the most accurate that I know of." And Dr. Storm goes on to classify the promises in different categories. And it's interesting to note that 85% of all the Bible's promises are from God to man. Over 7,400 of that 8,800 are from God to man. Now, there are other promises from man to man. There are other promises that God makes, that even Satan makes to Jesus and other men. We see that in the temptation where he made promises to Jesus. So there are other promises listed there. But 85% of those promises counted by Dr. Storm are from God to man. And that's a large number. And he goes on to say this. He says, the most outstanding chapter as far as the promises are concerned is found in Psalm 37. Practically every verse in Psalm 37 is a promise. And what an amazing thing when you look not only at the anchor of God's presence, but you have the anchor of God's promises. And you can think in your life of things that God has promised in Scripture, and things that he has given you peace about, and the promises in your own heart that have come to pass. God is there. Now, our timing is not always his timing. And a lot of times we need to recognize that when we pray and we claim these promises, we have to pray according to his will. And we know his revealed will as far as the promises are written in Scripture as counted by Dr. Storms. But I can assure you that anytime God makes a promise, anytime that a promise is put out there in writing, Because God cannot lie, because God is just and holy, we know also that those promises are going to come to pass. And we're so grateful that we serve a God that guarantees these promises. Now, I've seen promises in the sports realm, as you have, of guarantees that have been made that we're going to win this or we're going to win this championship. And sometimes it comes to pass, but more than often, these promises and guarantees are not going to transpire because God is all powerful and God is able to keep these promises. And one of the other anchors, not only we see the anchor of God's promises, we see an anchor of God's presence as we looked at before, but the third anchor I want to focus on is found in verse 24. It says, saying, and this is Paul, fear not, Paul, for thou must be brought before Caesar. Again, this is what the angel has said in the previous verse, saying, fear not, Paul, for thou must be brought before Caesar. And look at this, and lo, God hath given thee all them that sail with thee. So we see the fact of the anchor of God's control. Some would say sovereignty. And so when we're looking at God's sovereignty, we are not only guaranteed His promises are going to come through, but God is working it out. God is working out the details according to His perfect will. And that's something assured that we should have. It may not look like it is. It may seem like what we're seeing today with all these protests and riots and things going on in our society, that God is not in control, but actually He is. Nothing takes God by surprise. God knows everything that's going on. He knows everything that's going to come. He's a God that is not bound by time. He doesn't have a timeline. He's not bound by a chronological scale or cosmic time frame. He can step out to any point on the line of eternity from past, present, to future. So He has total control and total sovereignty in all matters. And we see that, for instance, we look at Romans 28:28, very common verse. We know that all things work together for them that love God, for them that are the called according to His purpose. We see other passages in Psalm 57, Isaiah 45, and the list goes on and on and on of how all things work together and God is in control. And so we can hang our hat, we can put our anchor in, knowing that God's going to be in control. I worked with a guy one time, and he could speak very little English. He was Vietnamese, great, godly person, but one of the statements he always would say when we would bring up questions or difficulties, he would say, God knows. God knows. And we understood those two words, God knows, because what he was literally saying was God is in total control. He's not taken by surprise. And that's what I'm telling you today, is that God knows. God is in control. You can put an anchor down on that one. There was a story of Emperor Charles V. He was trying to assassinate a man by the name of John Brenz. And John Brenz, if you don't know who that was, he's a friend of Martin Luther, the great reformist. Well, John Brenz, when he heard the plot against his life, he got a little fearful, of course, as you can imagine, that the Emperor Charles V was going to send men to kill him. So in haste, John Brenz, he got up, he ran to a neighboring hayloft in the barn, and he hid at the very top of the hayloft, and he tried to make himself as quiet and as inconspicuous as possible. And he was actually there for a total of 14 days. But what was interesting was, during that time, he had nothing to eat. But each and every day, without a fail, of those 14 days, the Lord would send a hen. A hen would show up to the top of the hayloft, and that hen would lay one egg. And by laying this one egg, John Brenz was able to keep himself fed and sustained for a total of 14 days. And it was without a doubt, every day, that hen would show up. Well, on the 15th day, the hen didn't show up. And John Brenz was a little concerned. Lord, I don't know what's going on here, what's happening. And all of a sudden, as he was reflecting on the fact this hen hasn't showed up, he heard a shout from the streets. Cries came out from the streets that the cavalrymen are gone at last. The cavalrymen are gone at last. So God was in control in the life of John Brenz. He provided for him. We see numerous accounts, not just in Scripture, but throughout history, of where God was in control. You think of Elijah being fed by ravens. You think of all these, God providing the ram in the thickets for the sacrifice when no sacrifice was brought. And so Abraham and what he had been given, and just time after time, you can see God's provision and God's control in the lives of men and women and Christians throughout history. So not only do we have that anchor of God's sovereignty, but the fourth anchor I want to point out is the anchor of God's ability. The anchor of God's ability. You know what the Lord told Paul all the way down in verse 44, I want to look at the end of the passage. It says, and the rest, that is the men that fled the ship, some on board and some on broken pieces of the ship. And look at this, and so it came to pass that they escaped all safe to land. Again, just as was promised, God was in control. And God was capable, or God had the ability or capability to complete the task, and he came through. And one of the times, sometimes we go so far as to say, yes, we see God's presence. Yes, we see his promises. Yes, we know he's in control, but then we stop there. And we don't realize that God has the ability and capability to do anything. Matter of fact, the scripture is very clear when the question is asked, is anything too hard for God? We see that asked several times in the Old Testament. And we see even in Job. Job in chapter 41, I believe, is the question that Job asked, is there anything that thou cannot do or canst do? And so, without a doubt, we must confirm the fact that God has the ability to carry this out. You know, what the Lord told Paul and what Paul believed would happen came to pass. Everyone made it safely to the shore. God kept his word. He spared every life and proved himself to be as good as his word. And God is able to work it out in your life. You might say, well, I'm going through this time and you don't have an idea what I'm experiencing, Pastor Jeremy, but let me tell you something. You've got to trust and believe that God is able. He has the ability. I mean, we sing that child song, he's able, he's able, he's able. We know that God is able to deliver thee, and yet we don't truly believe it in our heart. And Corrie ten Boom, the author Corrie ten Boom, states this. Listen, it says, when Jesus takes your hand, he keeps you tight. When Jesus keeps you tight, he leads you through your whole life. When Jesus leads you through your whole life, he brings you safely home. What a truth that is, of the fact that God has the ability. And oftentimes we sell him short. Again, Job's saying in chapter, I thought about his first, it's chapter 42. He says, I know that thou can do all things and do everything. And he's realizing that God is in control, and not only in control, but he's able to carry you through and carry it out. And that's what these men saw on this ship. That's what Paul gave testimony of. The fact that not only is he present, but all the way through those four anchors, at the very end, he's very capable and has the ability to do anything he promises and carries out. I lacked this thought. Years ago, I had there was something that God used in my life to kind of confirm this fact. Not only is he present, not only does he keep his promises, and not only is he in control, but he can carry it out. And this may be a poor illustration, I don't know, but it just reminded me of kind of what we've been talking about here. But I did take a trip to Pensacola, Florida for a conference, and it was in February. And one thing I noticed as we were coming from Atlanta, as where our stopover was, we were flying into Pensacola Airport, National Airport. And as we were flying in, the pilot began to tell us that there was great overcast. And as we looked out, we could see that down there was great overcast as we started to descend. And he told us also that the navigational system that helps guide planes into the airport was not working. And Pensacola Airport did not have it working at the time, so he had to manually land the plane. So as he began to descend and you could hear the landing gear come out, as we looked out the window, I could see nothing but just dense fog or cloud. And as far as the eye, as you could see, you couldn't really see far, but you were looking for a break in the cloud or the fog is by your window, but there was no break. No matter how low he got, there was no break in the action. And I don't think to this day I've ever seen that before, and that kind of density. But anyway, we were almost landing, and you could feel that it was getting close, but you just couldn't see or tell. And as we were getting close, as what we thought were getting close, you felt the plane engines rev up, and just he went up again. He started to ascend. And he went up and he said, folks, I apologize. We just can't land right now. I can't see anything runway-wise. We don't have a navigational system, so we're going to circle. So he began to do a few circles up above, hoping that things would break. And as the plane would bank to the right and you could look down a little bit, you could see little breaks in the clouds or the fog area, but it was by far some of the most density I've ever seen. And so we made a few circles, and the pilot announced that he would try it again. So he came back around, he tried it again, same thing, clouds, and you're hoping for you would hit that break in the action. All of a sudden, as we're getting near the landing gears out, woof, the plane takes off again. And we're just like, wow, this is unbelievable. And he says a statement you don't want to hear. He says, folks, we're going to have to make a landing to refuel at Mobile, Alabama. So we went all the way to Mobile, Alabama. Not real far, but it was out of the way, definitely. And we landed in Mobile. We stayed there maybe an hour and 15 minutes to refuel. We take off again out of Mobile, Alabama. We're on our way to Pensacola, and much time has passed, maybe another hour. And so we're getting close, landing gears out, ready to go. We're excited about this. We're looking out the window again saying, I don't know if this is going to work because we can't see a break in the action. It's still as dense as it was before. And so as we get close, again, same result, you guessed it, landing gear out, almost to the runway, takes off. People are not very happy by now. He says the same thing. We're going to circle about 2 times, see if we can come in. We circle 2 more times, comes back around. We're not expecting much. So what happens was, again, the landing gear's out. The plane does not land. It takes off. And people are saying words and things I cannot repeat, but it is not a pleasant sight. And then he says a statement you really don't want to hear. The pilot says, folks, we're going to have to regroup. I'm sorry, but we have to take you back to Atlanta. And that's a pretty nice stretch. And so we were very unhappy. We flew back to Atlanta. We get off at Atlanta again, a great time later. And we're in Atlanta. We're at the gate. And it's been several hours now. It's getting into the later afternoon, evening. And we wait there for another hour or so. People are just deciding, should we rent a car? Can't you get us on another plane? We're not sure what to do. And anyways, we're sitting there, and all of a sudden, this pilot that we never saw before, very distinguished looking, a new guy, a new pilot, he comes out and he says, folks, can I have your attention? And he yells out to the gate where we're all at, a couple hundred of us. And he says, folks, I want your attention. Listen. And we're all listening, and he takes off his cap and he says, we are going to make another attempt to get you to Pensacola, and I will tell you one thing, we are going to get you there tonight. We're going to take this plane, we're going to bring it out of the hangar. It's a new plane, new technology, and we are going to make it. I guarantee it. And we're like, whoa. But we're like, yeah, right. Some of us are just doubting, but we're hopeful. What other choice do we have? So we all get on this plane, and it's beautiful. It's bigger than the one we had. We had video screens on every seat. They were rolling out the red carpet. They were trying to make us comfortable. They were giving us a lot of good food to eat that we normally wouldn't get on this stretch. But we took off, and we're on way. And as we're entering into Pensacola, a time later, of course, we notice that the clouds are picking up again. And they're just like we left them, but it's dark this time. Not only do you have the clouds, but you have the darkness. I'm looking out the window and you can see the clouds coming by, and you hear the landing gear coming out as we're descending. And again, we're all like, wondering how this is going to play out. And we see the clouds coming by and the darkness, and many of us are like, this isn't going to happen. Might as well just take us back. We'll rent a car. We'll stay the night. We'll do something and try it again tomorrow. And as we're watching, all of a sudden, before you know it, you feel the bump. And we've landed. And we're all like, whoa, and you hear cheers erupting all over the cabin of the airplane. And the pilot comes on and he says the following. He says, I told you we would do it. I made you a guarantee and I told you we would do it. And everyone, as we were leaving, this guy's a hero and he was great. We're thanking him. We're all excited to be in Pensacola Airport. But that reminded me, sort of like when you think about God and you think about His promises, you think about His presence, His promises, His control, and you think about His ability in your life, way beyond what that pilot was able to do in that instance where I experienced that flight, those flights. God is able to do far and exceeding more. He's perfect. He's all powerful. And He's going to accomplish these things in our stormy lives. When we face these lives, we face our storminess and the trials and toughness and all the problems that come our way. We can put our 4 anchors in the seabed of the storms and know that God's going to be there no matter what. And I just want to challenge you today as you look through, maybe you take some time to look at this passage and see the truths that God, for yourself, that God puts in there through the life of Paul. And again, I want to thank you. And Mr. Knotts will be back next week, but I just appreciate the opportunity to fill in, and at times we're hoping to do this again. So have a great week, and may the Lord bless you in all that you do.